Hello, my name's Maria Delgado, and I'm an academic critic and member of the selection committee for the London Film Festival. And it's my real pleasure to be here with Fernanda Valadez today, one of the co-directors of the wonderful film Sujo, which we screened as part of London Film Festival, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful feature. Fernanda, many congratulations on the film. It won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Festival, and it's been touring at film festivals really ever since. Were you and Astrid taken aback by the success of the film? Because the film is really speaking to people about a different side of cartel violence, and people can really identify with the characters in the film.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria, for doing this conversation with me. Of course, it was an honor to have the film at BFI this year. And every film, I think, it's a coin in the air. You do it because you think you have something relevant to say, but you'd never know how that coin is going to land. And we have been very lucky that audiences around the world have identified and have been moved by this story. I think it's probably because in the end, although it has a very particular context of violence in Mexico, but it speaks about the pain of growing up, and I think that everyone can relate to that.
And you worked with Astrid previously. I have very fond memories of your last collaboration, Sin Señas Particulares, Identifying Features, another wonderful, wonderful film. And on that film, Astrid was the co-writer, but you were the director. And on this film, it's slightly different because you're co-directing. Tell us a little bit about the transition from that earlier film to this film and the way in which you share the kind of co-writing and the co-directing and the co-producing responsibilities and editing responsibilities on the film.
Well, Astrid and I know each other have known each other for many years since we were students, like 15, 16 years now. And I think it's a collaboration based on a creative communion, I might say. We really share a vision of how to make films, because for us, it's not only about the story, it's also the way we do films. It's something that matters. And we also share a vision of the kind of films we want to make. And ever since, because we began producing for each other, we have been going deeper in that collaboration. We began producing for each other, then we began co-writing, co-editing. And I think already in Cinseñas, in Identifying Features, it was pretty much the same process we did with Sujo. But what changed in this film is that also the production crew, younger female filmmakers that have collaborated with us for some years, they are now very mature, and we have the freedom to both be directing and with the actors and in front of the monitor and doing all the directing stuff without worrying about the production during the shooting. So that allowed us to name this collaboration as a co-direction and a co-authorship. But I do have to say that the main idea came from Astrid, and this was in the beginning meant to be her second feature, and it was also due to her generosity that we labeled this one as a co-direction.
And how do you work together? Do you take different responsibilities on the film? Does one of you work primarily with the actors? Does another one work primarily on the technical aspects? Tell us about how you share those responsibilities.
Well, Astrid, it's amazing with actors. So in Sujo, I think the main responsibility with the actors was hers. And of course, we had conversations and have notes all the time. I think the first 3 to 4 takes were Astrid's, and then if we felt that still had to make notes, then I talked to the actors for the fourth or the fifth or the sixth take. I must say, I like to do a lot of takes. I was a little bit more on the technical aspect of the film, but we were discussing everything all the time, and I think a tool that was really helpful for us was a storyboard. Astrid's a really talented artist. She really can draw because I can only do, I don't know, circles and sticks. But we would take some time also with the photographer, Jimena Mann, to have conversations between the three of us and really discuss what we wanted to achieve in terms of image and staging and rhythm with every scene. And we would spend the time having those conversations in the weekend before a working week. So that was very helpful because we didn't waste time during the shooting having those conversations. We on location we had already agreed on what we wanted to achieve.
And one of the things I think is extraordinary about the film is the performances. And I love the fact that you choose to have two actors play the character of Sujo from the ages of 4 to 17. I wondered about your decision to have the two actors and about the casting of Kevin Uriel and Juan Jesús Varela, and you'd worked with the latter, of course, on identifying features. So tell me about the casting of those two actors and your work with them, because I think it's very delicate and beautiful work.
Thank you, Marie. Well, I think since the first draft of the script, we already had Juan Jesus in mind. And precisely because we had already worked with him in identifying features, we just couldn't get him out of our minds. And we kind of made a deal with him because he was very young. He was 15 when we met him for that other film, that he should finish high school and then we would be able, if he, of course, if he wanted to cast him for Sujo. And he was really disciplined and because he was sure he had found his calling in life as an actor. So I think pretty much we designed the cast around him. And I wouldn't call him anymore a non-professional actor because during these times in the years between identifying features and Sujo, he has done short films and music videos and he had a small part in an Amat Escalante film. So I think he's been really certain that he wants to prepare himself to become a professional actor. With the kids, that was another story because they were very young. Kevin had just turned 4 years old. And I think, of course, he's an incredibly talented young kid. But with kids so young, it was pretty much Astrid's work, I have to say, because even though I was there all the time, but she was really able to make this imaginary world around the scene. So for Kevin, it was a matter of coming to play, but the play was interesting enough and long enough, so it lasted um, all the weeks that we needed him to be with us. And something really beautiful happened is that kids grow up really fast. And during the first weeks, he was receiving more specific directions of movement and a more narrow game. But as the weeks passed, around the sixth week, the week number 6, he was asking questions almost like a grown-up actor, like, what was the scene before this one? Why am I feeling this? And where am I going next? And so it was really moving.
Oh, he's wonderful. There's a wonderful early scene, a brilliant early scene when Kevin sits in the back seat while his father deals with business and someone disappearing, and that's a family business, and the ways in which what happens to him when this is all you've seen. And I think it's so beautifully handled because you're watching him reacting to this normalization in many ways. And I think that that's so delicate and so beautifully handled. And secondly, another scene where the local drug chief comes looking for Sujo. And you have your director of photography, Ximena Man, who crouches under the kitchen table with Sujo, with Kevin, who wets himself in fear. And those are just two of my favorite scenes in the film, because both of them are showing the effects of that violence from the point of view of a child who is already beginning to normalize it as a part of life.
I think violence was one of the most critical questions that we asked ourselves, how to show that violence. And I think for us, it has almost kind of an ethical implication. In Mexico, after so many years of violence, of being, like you say, normalizing the images of broken bodies through every day, we felt that it was really important to show the consequences, the emotional consequences of that violence, instead of showing the physical result of violence on a human body. And well, that was what we tried to express with that. And in terms of the work with Kevin, with the kid, what we did was having two scripts: the script that her mom read to him, and the script that was actually in the film, so he could handle that violence in a safe and but at the same time interesting way. So it was kind of a game, but and so we shot that scene. What you see in frame with him, and the actors were kind of playing with him and teasing him. And then we shot with them the sound, particularly with what was actually going to be on the scene.
Well, it works so well. And it's part of the ethos of the film where the violence is off screen. It's in the distance. And you're absolutely right. It is about seeing the consequences of that violence. And I think you capture so well also the sense of how those cartels operate, the whistling codes of the sicarios, the numbers indicating their place in the cartel. There's a whole kind of code in the film that you're dealing with that I think is beautifully handled, because you understate it. It's just the way they operate. There's very little exposition, and I think there's a real trust in the storytelling in that way that I think works so well.
Thank you so much. Well, I think part of the challenges that we had, even from the script, was how much to show in terms of the context, and how much just to let the audience feel, even though it left unanswered questions about how really is working the machinery of the organized crime. And I think it was when we decided to stick to the emotional impact of violence on the characters, it kind of everything flowed from there. So we stick to that, and so we decided not to show that much, just to leave unanswered questions, but to tell enough so the audience could follow in terms of the emotional path of the character, how violence became as he grows up and begins his journey in adolescence and early adulthood, almost like a rite of passage, like in these communities in Mexico, in this adverse environment. Becoming a young man involves going to this danger of organized crime.
I wondered if you were influenced by Greek tragedy at all, because I felt that there was I felt that the shadow of Greek tragedy ran over the film. The sense in which members of families are destined to follow in the footsteps of their father, and the violence begetting violence. That and they can't escape that kind of cycle of crime and death and murder that just hovers over everything. So I wondered if that had been an influence on you, because that's one of the things I really admire about the film, the way in which you have these premonitions that something terrible is going to happen at some point, and just the hovering of violence over everything, even though that violence is off screen.
I think probably indirectly, we weren't, to be honest, we weren't thinking about Greek literature, but I think our main influence, even more than films we love, I think it was the 19th century literature that also deals about destiny, and perhaps more in social terms. I think we were thinking about um, Thomas Hardy and all his ruminations about this opposition between the social context and destiny, and of course Dickens and also the stories of the orphans. And we do believe that facing a social crisis through the eyes of a kid really allowed us to tell the story in more emotional terms instead of more a mental way. So I think Thomas Hardy really is at the bottom, and we try to offer a different alternative, because I mean in Thomas Hardy, particularly in Jude the Obscure, he concludes that you cannot beat destiny, but we want to say otherwise.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I really like about the film, that you actually, probe that. What does agency mean in this society? And I think that the role that women play in nurturing Sujo feels really important. The women characters are seen as protective and nurturing figures, and I'm thinking about Nemesia and Rosalia, his aunt Nemesia, and the teacher who takes him on board. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about these figures, these educators in the film, and these women who are able to assist him in finding a different way.
I think we wanted to make an homage to women in Mexican society, and probably women in many societies in crisis, and in general in the world, in a moment in which masculinity, perhaps it's in a little bit of the concept of masculinity, it's a little bit in crisis. We wanted to ask how the personality of a young boy is formed, and we couldn't think it but through the eyes of the women that stay in their communities, resist violence, and open an emotional alternative for this kid. So it's not about women being good and men being violent. I think it's trying to respond to this open question about how, particularly in Mexico, kids are really vulnerable, boys in particular, to recruitment of organized crime, because the way masculinity is it's formed socially. How do boys need to assert themselves to their peers? How they need to appear as strong, as dominant, and that puts them in a very delicate and vulnerable situation. And opposed to that, in many communities in which migrants, male migrants, have left, and communities are mostly formed by women, those women are doing a very active resistance to violence and to organized crime. And we have very clear examples in Mexico, like the mothers looking for their missing son, which was a theme of identifying feature, but also the activists or everyday women who try to find alternatives to a life in the cartels. And there's another part also. I think in every society, there's a point in which we all receive assistance or an act of kindness from someone we don't expect, someone who is able to break through the barriers of gender and class. And I think that's what happens with the teacher, a woman who comes from a dictatorship in Argentina, lands in Mexico, and is able to see something special in this kid.
I want to ask you about the casting of the women, because you were talking earlier about Juan Jesus, who is a professional actor, not classically trained, but professional, but the two women performers you have playing Nemesia and Rosalia are trained professional actors, and you made a decision to cast them. I wonder if you might talk about that decision, and then we can talk a little bit about the actress who plays Susan, Sandra Lorenzano, who brings a different lived experience and lived history to that role.
Well, Yadira Pérez, who plays Nemesia, and Karla Garrido, who plays Rosalia, like you say, are both professional actors. And we wanted to cast them because we knew they would be really important for the work with the children in particular. And they were so invested and flexible and just completely committed with the project and us, that through them it was so much easier to work with the children, because they were like in character all the time. We at some point we didn't even know, or we didn't have to say action for them to be playing already the character. So the children really felt like they were being themselves and just relating to someone they trusted, and someone who felt like family to them. So they were really, really important about that. And well, then Sandra Lorenzano, uh, I think that character of Susan, it was kind of difficult because we needed to remain realistic about the context in Mexico, but finding a character that would help us to open a more hopeful result in the film. So we were casting in the casting process, and it was almost a coincidence that we were invited to a conversation with Sandra Lorenzano, who is a professional writer, a teacher, a professor in that same university that is portrayed on the film, and who had a history of coming from Argentina to Mexico. And it was like a gift that was left in her lap. And we decided that we wanted to invite her to do the character in the film. And because Sandra is so playful and open to opportunities in life, she said yes. And I think it was really important that we could borrow a little bit of her life to finish the writing of the character.
Yeah, all three of the women, I think, are really well characterized and very distinctive personalities. And I think that point you make about it's not that women are idealized, they see a different way and they see a way out, and they are protective of their sons, because of course Rosalia has two sons, Jairo and Jeremy, who go a different way to Sujo in many ways, and you see the pull, the allure of the cartels and what they offer. That is a form of temptation, and you see Rosalia as you know a good mother, a devoted mother, and one that you know that who cannot keep her children safe. And I think that's so well handled in the film, the difficulty of that protective role, wanting to give their children agency, but feeling how their children are being pulled, their sons are being pulled in very particular directions.
I think that was really important for us, that we didn't say that these kids weren't loved, or they didn't have supporting families. I think it was important to show social conditions, like you say, pulling these kids towards recruitment. Uh, so we have good kids in bad situations. And that's something that is also sad about our reality. It's not that kids are inherently bad. It's that we are permitting social conditions that lead him to a path of violence, and many times of self-destruction. And at least for me, Hai is one of my favorite characters because, I mean, he's a good kid. He's just in a very complicated world, and of course Rosalia is trying to protect him, but what she can do as a mother in those circumstances, it's not enough, and not because of her, but because of the circumstances.
And tell me about the role of the natural world. I think, and this is beautifully handled, not just in the visuals of the film, but in the sound. That um, through all the violence that surrounds this world, it's also incredibly beautiful. And the sound of the insects, the goats, the horse, it provides a real sense that this is a world of, that brings, a relationship to the land, which of course Nemesia, Josue's sister, is very rooted to. That also Sujo identifies with some way, and his father before taking a different path. So I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the role of the natural world in the film, because I think it's incredibly powerful.
It was important for us to have this almost irony, this opposition of violence, particularly in the rural landscape, but at the same time, violence that happens among beauty, because nature um, doesn't react in immediate terms to our daily endeavors, and our pain and our struggles. So in a landscape where a murder takes place, or where someone is disappeared, at the same time there's beauty, and there's this, yeah, this contradiction, but at the same time there's something hopeful about that, and we wanted to show that, particularly from the perspective of Nemesia, who is very spiritually rich, and through her also from the boy's perspective. So he is learning to relate to uh, the riddle of the universe, to a starry night, to fire, to death, and to everything that is complex in human life through the Messiah's eyes. And for us, I think when we are talking about education, we don't only mean school and the institutionalized education, but also the education, the spiritual education that Nemesia gives to Sujo, in the sense that she makes him a more open and loving, and a boy capable of empathy, and feeling, not only for other human beings, but in general for life in nature.
And that, and it's a real contrast as well from when you move from that rural location to the city, where at some point Suho just becomes a figure in a crowd. It's easy to become hidden in the crowds, and there's a very different energy to life in the city, and the film looks very different when he moves to the city.
I think having the film divided into parts really gave us the possibility of tackle each episode stylistically in different terms. So what we see, for example, with the father, we wanted to have a little bit more contrast and to feel darker, not only in terms of lighting, but also in terms of emotion, of feeling. Then with Nemesia, it becomes a little bit more magical and open to all these mysteries of nature. And in adolescence, we again find the force of the context coming back for Sujo. And when we get to Mexico City, we wanted to feel like you say, he's a little bit lost in the crowd, but at the same time, he's in the process of finding himself. So we wanted to have that tension of having him portrayed up close and then having him in a longer shot in the crowds of this monstrous city that is Mexico City.
And tell me a little bit about the research for the film. What kind of research did you undertake in preparation for the film? Research on the cartels, on processes of adolescence, on the spirituality we're talking about in terms of Nemesia and those farming traditions on the land. Tell us a little bit about the role of research in the film and how it shaped the work that you undertook, both on the screenplay but also on cultivating the look of the film.
I think research for us is really, really important to really be able to compel a film that feels real, that even though it's fiction, doesn't feel fake. And I think the seed of this film were conversations we had with teenagers when we were preparing identifying features. And it was almost something we encounter because when we were preparing that film and we were talking to young men in the community and we heard stories of migration, of displacement, of having to leave their communities of origin to find a place in the big cities of Mexico, and also of early recruitment of boys and teenagers for organized crime. I think through their stories, we realized we wanted to tell a film about a boy growing up in this context. And then we did research through journalists, because in Mexico, I think the heroes of this country are the journalists that make research that go really deep into the issues that matter the most in our country. And particularly Javier Valdez, who is a journalist that was killed in 2017 because of his work. But the way he looked at reality, I think, opened for us a path that helped us to break prejudices of class and also because he looks at reality not in terms of victims or perpetrators, but in terms of a whole society that permits the social conditions in which anyone can transit or can become a victim or a perpetrator. So I think those were the two poles that allowed us to begin writing. And then and when we had an advanced script, we went back to the communities to talk again with young people and with people that had similar experience in general. So I think, yeah, that was kind of like the arch of research in the film.
And how has the film been received in Mexico?
Well, we had only shown it in a festival in Morelia, and we were really fortunate that it received several awards. But it's gonna premiere really soon, so it's gonna be on December the 5th. So we will see. We are really hopeful. Yeah, just hoping that people can relate to Sujo.
Oh, I'm sure they will. I have no doubt about that. before we finish, you actually wrote Sujo before filming Identifying Features. So I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about Sujo, being written before that film, and did the screenplay and somehow influence Identifying Features, and then perhaps we can talk a little bit about what comes after Sujo.
I think it did. I think in many ways it did, because it made us realize that um, we couldn't talk about this kind of recruitment in Identifying Features. In Identifying Features, because that film was born out of the shock and I think the pain of finding ourselves as, at that moment, young filmmakers, or people who have become adults in this crisis of violence. We were talking about enforced recruitment, and I think when, because we hadn't seen Identifying Features in quite some time, and the other day Astrid and I were talking about it. I think that film stops at the shock, and we realized we had another opportunity with Sujo. We had an opportunity of being more hopeful, of being able to look beyond the abyss that is horror and violence and brutality, and allow ourselves, even from fiction, to imagine a door, an escaping door to this horror that we live in Mexico, and just to imagine an alternative.
And you tell me a little bit about what you're working on next, because obviously you work so closely together, you and Astrid, and you've you work on all aspects of the production, also with a closely knit women-led team. We talked about Ximena, the director of photography. So tell me a little bit about that work, that kind of collaborative work, and what comes next, and your plans to continue working with this very close-knit team where it really does feel like a community, but also making films about communities.
Well, thank you for that. And we do feel like making films is just an amazing opportunity to have conversations about the things that matter the most, to us. And in this moment, it's still about the social context in Mexico, because it feels so urgent. I think our next film is going to take us to a perhaps different, not context, but a different focus. We're gonna talk about Mexico City in three periods of time, and how um, to look at that reality from the center that feels Mexico City, because it's like Sujo brought us to Mexico City, and then now this next film is gonna to look at how we are and how society has been built from the perspective of the capital. But it's still a little bit early to talk about more. And the way we talk is like one of us has an idea, and before Sujo, that determined who was going to direct it. But now it's just a matter, it's like a game of ping pong. Um, the one that has an idea makes the first draft, and then the other responds, and that's how the conversation begins. And of course, for us, the work of the cinematographers and of Diana, the producer, it's really important, and we begin talking with them very early in the process. And Astrid is working on another film, a film that is going to be shot in English, so we will see.
I love the fact that film, you talked at the beginning of the interview about growing up through film. You grew up with your team and grew up as filmmakers, and a new confidence has come through that work that you've undertaken together. And I think it's really inspirational, the ways in which you forged community through those filmmaking relationships that you've cultivated, and it really does feel like a women-centered cinema, that's driving the direction of travel on the storytelling, on the stories that are being told, but also on the language of cinema that you're utilizing, and that's very beautiful and very powerful.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it's so still to this point, and even though we have inherited a path made by other women in Mexico and in different countries, artists and filmmakers, I think we still assume a responsibility to open a path for younger women that are coming next. And it's just a fortune that we are able to make films and to talk about the things that are important to us.
Well, Fernanda, thank you for talking to me so eloquently about Sujo. You and Astrid have made a really beautiful film, and we look forward to sharing it with audiences and viewers here in the UK. Thank you. Gracias.